Welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for being here for today's teach-in featuring Professor Dr. Vincent Smiles, who is a professor in the Theology department. He's going to talk about MLK's letter from Birmingham jail. And don't be thrown off by his Minnesota accent. Professor Smiles.
Yes, my Minnesota accent. I'm originally from England. That's why that's a joke. It's great to be here. Thanks for coming, especially on such a cold day. I'm impressed that you're out and about. The letter from a Birmingham jail became one of the primary documents of the entire civil rights movement. It would not have been written if Martin Luther King Jr. had not been very unjustly put in prison for 11 days in Birmingham, Alabama. And it would not have been written, as I'll explain in a moment, but for 8 clergymen, he referred to them as. There were 7 Christian clergymen and 1 Jewish rabbi who had written a document. I'll get to that in a moment. I want to talk about briefly the circumstances in which it was originally written, and so why Martin Luther King Jr. put it together. But then I also want to talk about why this letter from a Birmingham jail is still profoundly important, in my opinion, for modern society and for the whole question today of our combating racism. I have a very personal investment, as I'll make clear, in combating racism. But at the same time, neither I nor anyone, in my opinion, is free of the problem of racism. It's something that we all have to face within ourselves. It's really a matter of painful confessions, as I'll make clear. So let's get into, first of all, why the letter was written and what were the immediate reasons. Why did he, while he spent these 11 days in prison, why did he write this letter? The immediate historical circumstances had to do with very early that year, January 1963, Governor George Wallace had been sworn in as the governor of Alabama. If you know anything about George Wallace, he was a very committed segregationist, one of the most racist governors that the United States has ever had. And he promised in his inauguration speech to uphold segregation forever. So the atmosphere in Alabama was very much against the civil rights movement. In April 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. Went to Birmingham, Alabama to organize peaceful, and I do want to stress peaceful protests against segregation. But he was arrested basically because they refused to give him a permit for the march, but he, of course, went ahead anyway. So he was arrested and put into prison, and he spent 11 days in a very unpleasant prison cell, a picture of that in a moment. 8 clergymen had written a call for unity. So these clergymen thought that they were being cooperative with the civil rights movement, but they called for unity, and they asked protesters, basically they were asking especially black people, to wait, not to join in the demonstrations, but to settle problems through the courts and through negotiation. They referred in their document, Call for Unity, to Martin Luther King Jr. as an outsider, as though he was an agitator coming in from the outside. And they suggested that the protests were causing hatred and violence. The deeper reasons, of course, simply had to do with the whole history of segregation in the South, and that peaceful protests were going on. These are just some stock photos of the kind of peaceful demonstrations that would take place during the civil rights movement. On the left there, you see Martin Luther King Jr. himself with some clergymen and rabbis who did join him in these marches. Notice that there are black and white people joining in the protests. The photo on the right is of the sit-ins in the South. As I'm sure you know, there were these signs up, whites only in various restaurants, whites and coloreds for different drinking fountains, for instance. Part of the protest was to sit in at counters and restaurants where black people were forbidden to go. And they would simply go there and sit peacefully and insist by their very presence to be respected and to be served. But very often they were forcibly removed. In fact, these peaceful demonstrations and sit-ins against segregation were met with sometimes horrendous violence. These again are just some of the stock photos of the kind of violence which took place, whereby the police literally attacked peaceful protesters. The most famous example of this is what happened at the Selma Bridge. The bottom photograph there, the man who is in the foreground shielding his head with a policeman standing over him, that is actually Representative John Lewis, who still serves in Congress to this day. And on this occasion, he was beaten so badly that his skull was broken. So the reactions of the police against the protesters were very often immensely violent. But Martin Luther King Jr. himself insisted that the protesters must be peaceful, and I'll spend a moment on that in a moment. So, having been arrested and thrown into prison, he heard of this letter from the 8 clergymen, this call for unity, and he decided that this letter, which had been published in the local newspaper, must be responded to. So that's a picture, a replica anyway, of the prison cell in which he was held for 11 days. You can see it's not exactly a pleasant place to be, even for one day. And he decided to write this letter, which, as I said, has become one of the most significant texts of the entire civil rights movement, and well worth our meditation even today. So I'm going to, for quite a big bulk of this talk, I want to familiarize you with some of the text of the letter from a Birmingham jail. Last year when I did this, I asked the audience, how many of you have read the letter from a Birmingham jail all the way through? And the answer was virtually nobody. Now, maybe you've all read it all the way through. I'm not going to ask you. I'm going to presume that maybe, however, it would be a good thing to reproduce some of the primary texts. If you've never read it, it's very, very easy to find online. You just have to Google "letter from a Birmingham jail." There are excellent texts available. And, you know, if you read it slowly, it might take you half an hour to get through the whole thing. Read it very slowly and meditatively, which might be a good idea. It might take you 40 minutes, but it's well worth it. And I think it's the kind of a searing document which hits hard at a person on the inside and requires some meditation. And requires, I think, especially for white people, to face up to the things which Martin Luther King Jr. Said in very graphic terms. Some of the quotations, which in fact I'm going to read here, are almost offensive, perhaps, to some people. But I decided to go ahead with them anyway. I'll warn you ahead of time what's coming a little bit. We today, Martin Luther King Jr., if you ask today what people think of him, he gets like a 90% approval rating. Everybody loves Martin Luther King Jr. In his time, his approval rating was down in the 30s. It was very low. He was seen as a communist, as an instigator, he was accused of causing violence as the clergymen did, even though he absolutely preached over and over and over again nonviolence. So I hope you can bear it. I'm going to be reading to you. I'm afraid my accent does not replicate at all Martin Luther King Jr.'s wonderful, sonorous, rhetorical tones. You'll have to put up with this British accent, I'm afraid. One of the early major points he makes in the letter: injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Speaking directly to these clergymen, he says, "You deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham. But your statement, I am sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations. I'm sure that none of you would want to rest content with the superficial kind of social analysis that deals merely with deals merely with effects and does not grapple with underlying causes. It is unfortunate that demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham, but it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the Negro community with no alternative. And they had tried negotiations." He describes fairly early in the letter the philosophy and the practice of nonviolent demonstrations, and it's a four-step process. It's something which, in fact, he would insist that the protesters, you must come to meetings and you must learn how to protest peacefully. And he describes here what these steps are. In any nonviolent campaign, he says, there are four basic steps: collection of the facts to determine whether injustice indeed exists, negotiation, self-purification, by which he meant he expected the protesters to be willing to enter into a certain amount of prayer. He was obviously a deeply religious man. He was an ordained Baptist minister. And that they would resolve within their minds and hearts not to engage in violence, not to respond to violence with violence, to go to the protest with the motivation of simply offering their bodies as a sacrifice. And yes, you might be the victim of violence, but you will not inflict it. And you will simply raise the consciousness of people by accepting violence if that is necessary. This is quite a difficult challenge for people to go through. And then, of course, there's the direct action itself, which means engage in the marches or the sit-ins or whatever it is that's going to happen. He says to the clergymen, "We have gone through all of these steps in Birmingham, but there can be no gainsaying the fact that racial injustice engulfs this community. Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of brutality is widely known. There have been more unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than in any other city in the nation." Our speaker on Monday mentioned that Birmingham became known as Bombingham because of the number of bombings and bombings that were simply never solved. The police didn't bother worrying about such things. These are the hard, brutal facts of the case. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. And so then he describes why it is necessary to take direct action. And one of the major points that he makes in this letter is that waiting is not an option. The clergymen had called upon the protesters to wait. Just time will change things. Everything will come right in time. And we still sometimes to this day, people say, oh, time will change things. But Martin Luther King Jr. rejected that idea. He said, no, it is not time to wait. And here we're going to come upon some of the most difficult and plaintive language which he uses in this letter. In the next slide after this one, including language which some people might find offensive. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering, as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness towards white people. Here's some very harsh language, and I hope you won't be offended. When you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored, when your first name becomes nigger, your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and your last name becomes John, and your wife and mother are never given the respectful title Mrs. When you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with the inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over. A major point he makes in this letter, and one which I think we need to take to heart today, the dominant white culture of modern United States needs to take heart, is what he said about the failure of the church, which I'll get to next, and the failure of the white moderates. I must make 2 honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderates. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. And then he moves on to the failure of the church. And remember that Martin Luther King Jr. himself, his great-grandfather, his grandfather, his father had all been ministers in the church. He was born and bred in the church. As he says in this quotation, he loved the church, but he nevertheless points very forthrightly to the failure of the church. Let me take note of my other major disappointment. I have been so greatly disappointed with the white church and its leadership. Of course, there are some notable exceptions. I am not unmindful of the fact that each of you has taken some significant stands on this issue. But despite these notable exceptions, I must honestly reiterate that I have been disappointed with the church. I say this as a minister of the gospel who loves the church, who was nurtured in its bosom, who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings, and who will remain true to it as long as the cord of life shall lengthen. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Every day I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust. I'm going to turn now from quoting from the letter. Those are some of the major points, but there's a lot more that could be quoted, and I again urge you, if you've never read the letter for yourself, read the entire thing. I'm now going to describe to you a little bit of my own personal investment in this, and it requires me just to tell you a little bit about my family. So here is my wife and me. This is a picture of this from this last summer. We're in our son's backyard on a hammock thing. So my wife is black. She was born in the Bahamas. And we have 3 beautiful sons. Here they are. This is a picture slightly old. It's just a few years old. They're all born. They're all not born. They're all married now. Have children. Here are 4 of our 6 grandchildren. You can see that we're a multicolored family. The 2 on the left are brother and sister. That's Will and Anna. They're both a little bit older now. You can see that Anna has some black features, far more so than her brother. I'm wondering if in the years ahead Will pass for white and Anna not so much. The one in the middle is our second to youngest grandchild. Her name is Danielle, and her sister is on the right, Liv. Again, there's a slightly notable color difference between them. But they're all equally our grandchildren. Needless to say, we love them all like crazy, same as anybody loves their children and their grandchildren. We're a multicolored family, and so for obvious reasons, I've always found racism offensive, deeply offensive. But I am not innocent of racism. I am not innocent of racism. None of us, in my view, none of us in this society is innocent of racism. I don't mean by this that I or I suspect you of, Ku Klux Klan racism or of any kind of malicious racism. But the simple fact is I was born and I was raised in a racist society. I was born and raised in Northern England. Until the age of 21, I never even met a black person. I didn't know any black people. Now, my family was not racist in any overt sense whatsoever. My parents were deeply religious, Catholic. They lived very much by the law that you must have respect for everyone. And they never, ever, in my entire experience, said anything negative about any person on the basis of either their religion or their place of origin or their race. They always taught us to respect people. So when I, as a 21-year-old coming out of college, went to do volunteer work in the Bahamas, which is a black country, I thought of myself as not a racist person at all. In fact, I hadn't really even encountered the word racist in England. It just wasn't an issue with which arose. But when I was in the Bahamas, and so I was then working with black people, the Bahamas, as you probably know, is predominantly a black country. Although up until 1967, it suffered under a sort of a mild, wasn't nearly as bad as in South Africa, but it did suffer until 1967 under a kind of a mild apartheid system. There was a minority white government which ensured that black people would not vote, or that if they did vote, they would vote the right way. But in 1967, that system had finally been broken. And when I got there in 1970, therefore, there was a black majority government, and you might say that black consciousness was on the rise. But this country was still suffering from economic apartheid, and to some extent that prevails even to this day. I had to encounter in the Bahamas my own racism. Now you might say, well, what kind of a racist were you? And there's all kinds of racism, but there's no innocent racism, and it is the unchallenged and unspoken racism which is within us, which enables the system of segregation, the social hierarchy of segregation to continue. And it's why I insist that we all have to examine ourselves and our attitudes. I had been in the Bahamas, I think maybe a year, maybe slightly more. And what particularly sparked my beginning to recognize how racist I was I had a conversation with a young man, and he was, we were just friends, we had met at church, and he was describing to me how he was about to go to college, and he was going to be studying mathematics, and he told me how he loved math, and he was looking forward to doing this. And I was very, friendly and polite, of course, to him, and I wished him well, and that was the end of the conversation. However, I had a very weird reaction to this conversation because I kept saying to myself, for some reason, and I couldn't understand why I was saying it, there's no way that he can go to college and study mathematics. And I had this recurring tape running in my head saying, he can't go to college and study mathematics. And then I thought, why am I thinking that? That's so stupid. He has described to me his love for mathematics. He had gotten good grades in school at mathematics. It's perfectly logical for him to go to college and study mathematics. And yet I couldn't, somehow there was something inside of me that was rebelling against this idea. And it took me a week. It took me a week of kind of puzzling, what is wrong with me? And I finally said to myself, you're racist. Racism was in the air in the Bahamas at the time. Racism was the kind of an issue which you had to talk about and think about. I had been pushed on the side of the road by a small group of black men when I early in my days in the Bahamas, because they were, they said to me, get on the side, whitey, because they were angry at the situation of apartheid, which has only just been broken in the Bahamas. So racism was a live issue in the Bahamas, and I was obviously having to think about it, but I was totally convinced that I was innocent of all racism. I realized with that experience that I was not. And the reason I finally worked it out, why I had that sort of a reaction, was that in my background, although there was no malicious language or attitudes that I had ever picked up towards people of a different color, race, or religion, the only images which I had had in my childhood and early years of black people was of black people being helped by white people. I remember there was this charity box in our living room in my home where you were supposed to put pennies. And the picture on the box was of little black children in Africa being helped by white missionaries. And white missionaries had come to my school and told us about helping the little black children. And of course, this was the kind of an image I had. The kind of racism which was in me was a very paternalistic, looking down upon black people racism. And that's what I then finally encountered it within myself in the Bahamas, and which I had to, so to speak, take out of the closet of the back of my mind, look at it, realize how stupid and horrible it is, what effect is it having on my attitudes and behavior, and start the process of reformation. And one of the things which I think is important about Letter from a Birmingham Jail is that Martin Luther King Jr., he attacks the conscience of the clergymen. And he says to them, I am disappointed with the white moderate. I know that you've done some good things. He gives the example of the Reverend Stallings allowing black people to come into his church and sit wherever they wish, non-segregation basis. He gives the example of a white college which had desegregated years earlier and allowed black students to come into the college. He was grateful for those steps. But he says in letter to a Birmingham jail, as we read a few moments ago, I am disappointed with the white moderate. In some respects, the white moderate is more of a barrier than the Ku Klux Klan. Because the Ku Klux Klan you can easily identify. But the white moderate racism is insidious. It's the white moderate racism which prevails in our country to this day and causes all kinds of statistics which you can easily look at. And since I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an expert at the statistics, I'm only going to mention just a few. But I looked up some statistics just the other day. And for instance, if you ask the question, what is the average income of white Americans versus black Americans in this country? The difference is massive. As of a few years ago, going back into the early 2000s, for the average white American family, the average income was around $31,000 per annum. For the average black family, it was $18,000 per annum, less than 50%. More recently, the average income for a white family has risen to about $61,000. For the average black family, it is down around $30,000 per annum. This has nothing to do with ability. This has nothing to do with the willingness to work. It has nothing to do with the number of jobs a person works. It has to do with systemic segregation such that black people just cannot get employment, or they have to settle for less employment than they should have. My wife has suffered personally from this. I won't tell her story because she doesn't like me to tell stories on her, but I know for a fact that she has in fact herself suffered from this. And it has been a problem over the years. Unemployment among black Americans is far higher, usually at least twice as high in most cities and parts of the country as it is among white Americans. Why is that? It has nothing to do with black people not applying for the jobs. It has nothing to do with whether or not they're qualified. Very often they're more qualified than their white counterparts. Just a few weeks ago, I saw on PBS, they gave a report with respect to bank loans. And poorer white families receive approvals of bank loans at a far higher rate than richer black families do. And house prices in black neighborhoods are routinely devalued, even though by every measure they should be valued much higher than houses in white neighborhoods. If you ask black people, is racism a problem in this country, you get, depending on which part of the country you're at, you get pretty high percentages in the 70s and sometimes up into the 80s. If you ask white people, is racism a problem in this country, again, depending on which area of the country you're in, you get answers around 40%, maybe slightly higher, again, depending on where you are. But if black people are perceiving that racism is a big problem, but white people are saying it isn't, where is the gap? And the gap has been identified by Martin Luther King Jr. It's the white moderate problem. It's that the vast majority of us white people do want, at least superficially, not to be racist and genuinely to be people of justice and equality. But it is not, in fact, easy for us to accomplish that. And why is it not easy for us to accomplish that? It's because that's just the mentality of the entire society, and it's not easy to fight against. It is not easy in a job situation to say, that's the person we should hire, when everybody else doesn't want to do that. And so the challenge which Martin Luther King Jr. places before us in Letter from a Birmingham Jail is a challenge of personal and spiritual conversion. We all have to face up to the racism which is within us, which is why I tell you my own painful confession. So I want to end by another quotation from Martin Luther King Jr., but this one is actually not from a Letter from a Birmingham Jail. This is from a lecture he gave at Stanford University. This is available online. The title of this speech is The Other America. And you can easily find it online, and actually there's a video of him giving this speech at Stanford University. And when you look out at the audience, it's a white audience. Now, I can't swear that there are no black people in the audience, but I couldn't find anybody, either on the stage with him or in the entire audience. It was just mostly white students. And so he said to them, he tried to raise their consciousness about what is the problem of segregation and what's one of its root issues. And he says the following: I submit that however unpleasant it is, we must honestly see and admit that racism is still deeply rooted all over America. It is still deeply rooted in the North, and it's still deeply rooted in the South. And this leads me to say something about another discussion that we hear a great deal, and that is the so-called white backlash. So this is, and we've seen this recently. Barack Obama became president of the United States, and I think that we could agree, I would certainly posit that we have had a massive backlash since then. And there was a backlash in Martin Luther King Jr.'s day to the small amount of progress that was made, and the problem of backlash continues. I would like to honestly say to you that the white backlash is merely a new name for an old phenomenon. It's not something that just came into being because of shouts of black power, or because Negroes engaged in riots in Watts, for instance. The fact is that the state of California voted a fair housing bill out of existence before anybody shouted black power or before anybody rioted in Watts. It may well be that shouts of black power and riots in Watts and the Harlems and the other areas are the consequences of the white backlash rather than the cause of them. What it is necessary to see is that there has never been a single, solid, monistic, determined commitment on the part of the vast majority of white Americans on the whole question of civil rights and on the whole question of racial equality. This is something that truth impels all men, all people of goodwill to admit. We simply have to admit it. We are still 2019, I forget the years at this age in my life. We are still in 2019 in a racist society. Of course, advances have been made. Of course, things are better than they were back in the 1960s, way better. But it is not the case that racism has gone. As Martin Luther King Jr. says here, racism is still deeply rooted in the North and the South of this country, and we have to face up to that fact. So I urge you again to read Letter from a Birmingham Jail for yourself. Meditate upon it, think about it profoundly, and let's all continue together a struggle towards equality and justice for everybody. Thank you very much. I'm hoping that you might have some thoughts, questions, disagreements. They're always fun. Please, go ahead.
So quick question. Everybody's going to have different viewpoints on this, I'm sure you have. But do you think there will ever be an end to racism?
That's a great question. To be honest, I would not expect it in my lifetime. I've sometimes said that about other things, and I'll say it about racism. Because I think it's too deeply grounded in us, and it suits the power structure of too many people well to have a situation where some people are disadvantaged. Now, it's not just racism, it's also, it goes along with the problem of poverty. One of the things that Martin Luther King Jr. did, in addition to fighting against racism, was that he fought very much against poverty. In fact, not too long before he was actually assassinated, he had begun a whole new program of campaigning for government programs to relieve poverty and to eliminate poverty in the United States. He was totally convinced that should be possible. The Vietnam War was going on, remember, in the 1960s, and one of the things that he railed against was spending all of those billions of dollars to bomb poor Vietnamese people. So he's very much against the war. Obviously that is wrong, he'd say, just in and of itself, but it's also a wrong use of resources. If we turn those resources towards elimination of poverty, we can do that. And the United States is rich enough to do that. There's no question about that. Racism goes along with that, because at the bottom of the pyramid, so to speak, and you'll see this if you Google, for instance, median income of families. Asian families are right at the top, along with white families, and then you go down the line to Hispanics and so on. They give you these statistics, and always at the bottom of the pyramid are black families. Because of racism, black people are always the worst targets of racism in this country, and to some extent in my own country also. And so they therefore are more the victims of poverty than are other people. So it's not just racism, it goes along with the whole issue of the power structure of the United States at the present time wants a situation where there's a large number of people who just have to work whatever will be accepted, minimum wage, and that's it. And black people are the victims of that. So as long as we have a political system, an economic system, which is determined to disadvantage a big chunk of the population, that's going to feed racism. So I'm afraid, with respect to seeing the end of racism in my lifetime, I'm fairly pessimistic. Now, what about your lifetime? That's more for you to answer than for me. We have made enormous strides. There's no question about that. And I think that with genuine effort, we can certainly make further enormous strides. I'd love to know what some of you think about the possibility of eliminating racism. Please.
You being a theology professor, how would you connect that question with original sin?
Yeah, good question. Well, you've asked a complicated question now, and you're going to get, I could lecture for another half an hour on this one. Some of my theology students are here, and they might know what I'm about to say about this one. I think of original sin in terms of human evolution. Humans are primates. We're animals. Now we're more than that, way more than that. I mean, I believe in the God and the relationship of human beings with God. But it is a fact that God has created us through evolution. And therefore, human beings have the instincts, the desires, the positive and the negative desires of our animal backgrounds. So original sin is our propensity for evil. And part of the propensity for evil in human evolution very definitely is tribalism. And tribalism is alive and well in the world at large. Just think of the genocides of the Second World War era, but which have then been followed by the genocides in Central Europe, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, for instance, in the 1990s, and in Rwanda, for instance, in the 1990s. Human beings are tribalistic. How do we overcome that? We overcome that in the same way that we're supposed to overcome original sin. We have to own up to our propensity for evil, and we have to be conscious about it, and then we have to cultivate virtues. We have to believe in ourselves that we can, in fact, do better. And that is what Christianity and other religions do preach in their different ways. So, yes, I think racism is a manifestation of sin, and including of original sin, of our animal propensities for selfishness. But I am also totally convinced that we can, at least on an individual level, and it's best, of course, when we, as communities, we work together on working our way towards justice and virtue. That makes sense? Other thoughts, questions? If you don't ask me questions, I might ask you something. How do you experience racism? Do you agree with me that racism is alive and well in America? Or are you not so sure about that? Please.
I agree. I guess in recent years I have had kind of a wake-up call because a few years ago, like 2-3 years ago, if you want to ask me that question, my answer would have been different. But in these past, especially year and a half, I've been exposed to the ways in which racism still exists and is still very deep-seated. And I think the most challenging thing about racism in 2019 versus racism in the 1960s is that it's often very implicit because there are laws against explicit racism, but there are still very many forms of implicit and subtle racism, whether it's a verbal microaggression or whether it's a white person getting in an elevator next to a person of color and instinctively moving their bag or something closer. It's very much still here, although harder to identify sometimes.
Yeah, thank you for that. I tend to agree with that. Yeah, it's a kind of a tacit and more subtle racism that we encounter these days, but it's no less real. And it's no less powerful in its effects. So there's a lot of work to do, in my opinion. About others, what's your view on how do you experience racism, or do you think it's alive and well or not? Please, Brandon.
So, since you've been doing this work for a while, and thinking about this for a while, could you honestly share with us what some of the challenges have been that you've experienced personally in having to confront not only your own internalized sense of racism, but having to confront others and their racism, and how you have managed to have healthy relationships or have managed to end relationships?
Yeah. I have mostly well, with respect to myself, fighting my own racism, because I've become sensitive to it over the years, and I'm able to own up to it. I have sometimes, just seen it within myself. I remember walking down the street, and a young black man, is coming towards me, and I'm very aware that I'm far more nervous because he's a young black man than if he was a young white man. And then I think, well, why? That doesn't make sense. But of course, what's happening is that I'm a victim of the stereotypes, which we're all victims of. And I've experienced racism a lot through my wife. Sometimes it's amusing, because Ingrid and I very often will walk hand in hand, and sometimes people walk into walls as they kind of gawk at us, and they're so surprised to see a white man and a black woman holding hands. So sometimes it's kind of amusing to see that kind of thing. My attitude towards people in that circumstance is, you know, I understand why for them this is surprising. When we first came here in the early 1990s, there was far, far, far more of that then. Central Minnesota has become a much more diverse population since that time, and so there's not as much shock among people these days. But there is some. But sometimes the experience has been really very negative. When, for instance, my wife was followed around the shop, and they even sent the police to our house because apparently something went missing from the shop, and therefore the people at the shop became friends as well. Obviously, it had to be the black person who took whatever, I think it was a camera that went missing, and the police came to our home. And on that occasion, I have to say that I kind of lost it. That's the one time I really became enraged and shouted at these policemen about how ridiculous and horrible this was, that they had done this to us. And I said to them, "Search the damn house! Go upstairs! You damn well look everywhere you can look. See if you can find your camera." And of course they couldn't. And the policemen kind of apologetically then left. So that was one of the more unpleasant experiences and disruptive of nice relationships. But I remember that one of those policemen came back to us later on and just, you know, was very friendly. And in fact, some of you will know the name. His name is Brian Kleinfeld. He's the young man, the young policeman who actually was killed a few years later when there was a robbery nearby, and he got out of his car and the robbers shot him. Brian Kleinfeld's Park is still right there in St. Joe. So, you know, in all kinds of different ways, I've experienced racism, you know, seeing my wife be ignored, standing in a line at a shop. Mind you, Ingrid's a very, very strong woman, so they actually don't get to ignore her for more than half a second. She very quickly steps forward and says, "Excuse me, I am the next in the line." And so, but you know, I've never lost any friendships over racism. I hope that wouldn't happen. I remember when Ingrid and I were married, and one of the first places we lived after our marriage in 1980 was New York. And a college professor, a friend of mine, said to me, showing his racism, "It must be very difficult sometimes to be in a marriage with somebody who's not as intelligent as you." And I looked at him and I thought, "Now you're an intelligent man, why are you assuming that this is the case?" And I just said to him, "That's just not true." You know, and explained to him, actually one of the reasons I fell in love with Ingrid, she thought it was just gorgeous. She was highly intelligent, as indeed she is. But I didn't lose the friendship over it, you know. And I don't know to what extent he learned. He still showed his, and actually he was a priest, but had not come to terms with his own racism. If I had accused him outright of racism, he would have been massively offended and extremely defensive. So, you know, one encounters those sorts of things, and you have to understand the human race. I guess I understand and have a certain amount of patience with people because I'm not perfect either. And I think that one of the things that we all need to do is to be patient with ourselves, but at the same time, be determined to change this racism. And before I let you go, let me also say, by the way, white people are not the only racists. I've spent years in the Bahamas, and you know, racism is alive and well among people of all sorts. Rwanda was about racism among black people. Bosnia-Herzegovina was about racism among white people. Racism is alive and well in all sorts of manifestations. What we have to learn to do is what these colleges are all about. The Catholic Benedictine values of love one another regardless our differences. In fact, we should be rejoicing and celebrating our differences, not be threatened by them. So, thanks for being here today. Read letter from Birmingham jail if you've not done that yet. Thanks for being here.